They always tell you war is chaos, but until you're in the thick of it, it's hard to grasp. I was a farm boy from Iowa, raised on the simplicity of plowed fields and open skies. But in January 1968, I found myself halfway around the world, trying to make sense of a jungle that seemed alive with dangers. Vietnam wasn't just a place. It was a different world, where the land itself felt like an enemy. I was 19 when I joined the army, barely old enough to vote, let alone carry a rifle. I'd seen the news clips, the grainy footage of helicopters and soldiers slogging through rice paddies. I thought I knew what I was signing up for. But nothing could prepare you for the smell of the jungle or the suffocating heat that clung to your skin. It wasn't just the sweat, but the fear that seeped into every pore, a fear that never quite left you. We were stationed near a village whose name I've long forgotten. Our job was to patrol the surrounding area, protect the villagers, and, of course, hunt for the elusive Viet Cong. They were ghosts in the trees, whispers in the wind. We'd find their trails, hidden traps, and remnants of their camps, but rarely saw them until it was too late. One morning, we set out before dawn, the jungle still wrapped in darkness. I was on point, my boots crunching softly on the trail as the others followed at a cautious distance. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. Every shadow felt like it could hide an ambush, every branch a potential tripwire. The tension was suffocating, but you couldn't let it show. As the first light of day broke through the canopy, we came upon a small clearing. There was a hut, its walls made of bamboo and thatched with palm leaves. It looked abandoned, but we knew better. "Check it out," the lieutenant whispered, his voice barely audible. I moved forward, my rifle at the ready, heart pounding like a drum. Inside the hut, the air was stale and thick with the scent of human sweat. There were no false floors or hidden weapons, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. Half-eaten food, a smoldering cigarette butt. I stepped outside and reported back. The lieutenant nodded, his face unreadable. "Stay sharp," he said. We pressed on, the jungle swallowing us again. That's when the silence broke, shattered by the sharp crack of gunfire. It came from the left, sudden and relentless. I hit the ground, my face in the dirt as the air erupted with chaos. Bullets tore through the leaves above us, their whine piercing my ears. "Contact!" someone shouted, but it was barely audible over the roar of gunfire. The next moments were a blur of motion and sound, returning fire, shouts, and the cries of the wounded. I crawled toward cover, my heart hammering in my chest. A soldier, a kid barely older than me, was down, clutching his leg as blood soaked the ground beneath him. I grabbed him by the straps of his gear and dragged him to a safer spot, the ground slick and treacherous beneath me. His eyes met mine, wide with fear, but there was no time for words. I pressed a bandage to his wound, my hands trembling as the reality of it all hit me. This wasn't training. This was survival. When the shooting finally stopped, the jungle fell silent again, an eerie, oppressive quiet. We regrouped, checking our men. 2 were injured, 1 badly. The medic worked quickly, his hands steady despite the tension that hung in the air like a storm. We'd driven them off, but at what cost? As we moved to extract, I couldn't shake the image of that soldier's face, his fear a reflection of my own. That night, as we sat in the safety of our perimeter, the jungle alive with the sounds of insects and distant gunfire, I stared at the stars and thought of home. I wondered if I'd ever see it again, if I'd ever feel the cool Iowa wind against my face or hear the laughter of my family around the dinner table. War strips you down, takes you to the rawest version of yourself. That day in the jungle, I learned more about myself than I ever wanted to know. Night in the jungle wasn't peaceful. It was a constant hum of noise, buzzing insects, distant animal calls, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But beneath it all was an uneasy quiet, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Sleep didn't come easy, not when you knew danger could creep in at any moment. That night, I sat with my back against a tree, clutching my rifle. My eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, trying to pierce the darkness. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright, but even their light felt fragile, swallowed up by the dense canopy above. Around me, the others were quiet too, their faces pale in the dim glow of the moon. I couldn't stop thinking about the ambush. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The flash of gunfire, the frantic scramble for cover, the way the jungle came alive with chaos. The soldier I'd pulled to safety, Eddie, lay a few feet away. His leg was bandaged, but his breathing was labored. He kept murmuring something about his mother, his voice soft and broken. The medic had done what he could, but Eddie needed to be medevaced out. Until then, all we could do was keep him alive. I looked at him, his face pale and glistening with sweat, and felt a surge of anger. At the enemy, at myself, at the whole damn situation. We were just kids playing a deadly game, and none of us really knew the rules. Sometime before dawn, the lieutenant crawled over to me. His face was gaunt, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "We're moving at first light," he said, his voice low. "Can't stay here." I nodded, though the thought of moving filled me with dread. Every step through that jungle felt like tempting fate, daring it to take another shot at us. But staying wasn't an option. The Viet Cong knew where we were, and they didn't leave loose ends. When morning came, the jungle was cloaked in mist. It clung to the trees and swirled around our boots as we moved. Eddie was carried on a makeshift stretcher, his groans of pain cutting through the stillness. Every sound felt amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a branch. We were exposed, vulnerable, and every one of us knew it. We hadn't gone far when the point man raised his fist, signaling us to stop. My heart leapt into my throat as I dropped to a crouch, scanning the trees for movement. The seconds stretched out, each one heavier than the last. Then came the sound, a faint rustle, like footsteps through underbrush. The lieutenant gestured for us to spread out, and I moved to the side, my rifle raised. My hands were shaking, the adrenaline surging through me like a live wire. The rustling grew louder, closer, until suddenly a figure burst through the trees. It wasn't the enemy. It was a young woman, her face streaked with dirt and her clothes tattered. She froze when she saw us, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, two children clung to her legs, their faces pale and frightened. The lieutenant stepped forward, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. He spoke to her in broken Vietnamese, his voice calm and steady. Slowly, the woman lowered her guard, though her eyes darted nervously to the trees around us. Through gestures and fragments of words, we pieced together her story. She was from a nearby village, one we'd passed a few days ago. The Viet Cong had raided it, killing anyone who resisted and taking what they wanted. She and her children had fled into the jungle, hiding among the trees. Her story sent a ripple through the group. None of us were strangers to the horrors of war, but hearing it from her, seeing the fear in her eyes, it made it real in a way that was hard to shake. The lieutenant decided to escort her back to her village. It was risky, but leaving her and the kids alone in the jungle was unthinkable. We formed a loose perimeter around them, moving cautiously, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. The trek was slow and tense. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes followed our every move. But the jungle remained silent, the tension building with every passing moment. When we reached the village, it was worse than I imagined. The huts were burned to the ground, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. The woman let out a cry, her hands flying to her mouth as she sank to her knees. The children clung to her, their faces buried in her tattered dress. The lieutenant ordered us to search the area. We moved cautiously, our rifles at the ready. The village was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. As I moved through the wreckage, my boot caught on something, and I looked down to see the charred remains of a bicycle. It was a small thing, the kind a child would ride, but it stopped me cold. I thought of my younger brother back home, of the way he'd race up and down our driveway on his old bike, his laughter ringing out like music. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to take a moment to steady myself. We didn't find any survivors. The woman and her children were the only ones left. The lieutenant radioed for a medevac, and we waited in the ruins, the weight of the place pressing down on us. When the choppers arrived, we loaded Eddie and the woman and her kids onto one, watching as it lifted into the sky. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt as I watched it disappear over the trees. They were safe for now, but we were still here, still caught in the grip of this unforgiving jungle. That night, as we set up camp a few miles from the village, I lay awake, staring up at the stars. The events of the day replayed in my mind. The fear, the tension, the small moments of humanity that shone through the darkness. I didn't know it then, but those memories would stay with me for the rest of my life, etched into my mind like scars. The next morning came heavy, the air thick with the lingering smell of ash from the burned village. We broke camp in silence, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. The jungle felt quieter than usual, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that crawled under your skin, the kind that warned you something was waiting. Eddie was gone, lifted away with a medevac the day before. I told myself he'd be all right, that the doctors would patch him up, but I knew better than to count on miracles. Vietnam wasn't a place for miracles. Our orders were simple: move deeper into the AO, area of operations, and secure a series of trails the Viet Cong used to move supplies. They called it cutting the arteries, a way to starve the enemy of their resources. It sounded easy enough on paper, but on the ground, it was anything but. I was back on point, my boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. The trail was narrow, flanked by thick vegetation that seemed to close in around us. It was hard not to feel exposed like a rabbit caught in the open. My eyes scanned the trees constantly, looking for the telltale signs of a tripwire or the faint glint of a rifle barrel. About an hour into the march, we came to a fork in the trail. The lieutenant ordered us to split into 2 groups to cover more ground. I went with a smaller team, just 6 of us moving cautiously through the jungle. We'd barely gone 100 yards when the point man, a guy named Riley, froze mid-step. "What is it?" the sergeant whispered, his voice tight. Riley pointed to the ground, and I followed his gaze. There was a thin wire, almost invisible, stretched across the trail at ankle height. My stomach sank as my eyes traced it to the base of a tree, where a crude but deadly mine lay buried. We backed away carefully, every movement deliberate. It wasn't just the mine that worried us. The wire could have been a distraction, a trap to funnel us into an ambush. We took up defensive positions, the jungle swallowing us as we melted into the undergrowth. Minutes passed, each one dragging on like an eternity. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, just as I started to think we'd overreacted, it happened. The explosion tore through the air like a thunderclap, shaking the ground beneath us. It came from the direction of the other group, the one we'd split from. Before the sound had even faded, gunfire erupted, sharp and relentless. We moved fast, breaking cover and sprinting back toward the trail. My heart pounded as the jungle echoed with the sounds of a firefight, shouts, the crack of rifles, the heavy thud of a machine gun. When we reached the scene, it was chaos. Smoke hung in the air, mingling with the sharp smell of gunpowder. 2 of our men were down, their bodies crumpled on the ground. The rest were pinned behind cover, returning fire against an enemy we couldn't see. I dropped to my knees behind a fallen log, my rifle pressed tightly to my shoulder. The adrenaline coursing through me made my hands steady, my aim true. I fired into the tree line, the recoil of the rifle grounding me in the madness. The firefight felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the gunfire tapered off, the Viet Cong melting back into the jungle as quickly as they'd appeared. We held our positions, waiting to see if they'd come back, but the jungle had gone silent again. It was only then that we moved to check the wounded. One of the men was already gone, his lifeless eyes staring up at the canopy. The other was still breathing, but barely. The medic worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, but the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. We didn't have time to grieve. The lieutenant gave the order to move, and we carried the wounded with us, their blood staining the makeshift stretchers. The jungle seemed to close in tighter as we pressed on, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a shroud. By the time we reached a defensible position, night was falling. We set up a perimeter, our movements sluggish with exhaustion. The medic stayed with the wounded man, but there was little he could do without proper supplies. I sat with my back to a tree, my rifle across my lap. My hands were trembling now, the adrenaline long gone. I looked down at them, at the dirt under my nails and the faint smear of blood on my sleeve, and felt a wave of nausea. The jungle around us was alive with its usual symphony of sounds, but to me, it felt like a predator circling its prey. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the Viet Cong were out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Sleep didn't come that night. It never did after a fight. My mind replayed the day's events over and over. The images burned into my memory. The explosion, the gunfire, the lifeless eyes of the soldier we'd lost. By morning, the wounded man was gone. The medic sat beside him, his head bowed in silent defeat. None of us said a word. We just packed up and moved out, leaving another piece of ourselves behind in that godforsaken jungle. Looking back, I can see now how those days shaped me, how they stripped me down to my core and left me raw and exposed. Vietnam had a way of doing that, of showing you exactly who you were when everything else was taken away. We kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because that's all we could do. We were different men after that fight. You could see it in the way we moved, more deliberate, more cautious. Every step was calculated, every noise scrutinized. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a deeper understanding of how fragile we really were. The jungle seemed endless. Every tree looked the same, every trail a mirror of the last. It was easy to lose yourself out there, both physically and mentally. The heat was unrelenting, sapping your strength, and the constant threat of ambush wore on your nerves. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and shallow. About a week later, we stumbled onto something that shook us all. We were cutting through a dense stretch of jungle when Riley, still on point, stopped dead in his tracks. "Over here," he said, his voice low and strained. We gathered around, our rifles at the ready. At first, I didn't see it. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the trees, I noticed the ground was disturbed. Aschalu grave. We dug carefully, not knowing what we might find. The smell hit us first, sharp and unmistakable. Inside were the remains of several people. Men, women, even a child. Civilians by the look of them. They'd been gone a while, but not long enough for nature to completely take over. Their bodies told a story we didn't want to read. A story of violence, of desperation. We didn't say much. What was there to say? We knew this war wasn't just fought with rifles and bullets. It was fought in the shadows, in the lives of people caught in the crossfire. The lieutenant marked the location on his map. There wasn't much else we could do. The grave would be left to the jungle, just another scar on a land already torn apart. That night, we set up camp a few miles away. I couldn't stop thinking about the grave. I wondered who they were, what their lives had been like before the war came crashing through. I thought of their families, if they had any left to mourn them. The jungle felt heavier that night, the darkness pressing down on us like a weight. I sat by the edge of the perimeter, my rifle across my lap, and stared into the shadows. It was hard to tell where the jungle ended and my thoughts began. War changes you. It strips away the illusions, the easy answers. Out there, among the shadows, you learn what it means to survive. But you also learn what it means to lose. The final weeks of that patrol felt endless, as though time itself had stretched and twisted in the heat and humidity. Each day brought a fresh trial, another hill to climb, another river to cross, another moment where life could change with the click of a trigger. We pushed deeper into the jungle. Our numbers thinned, but our resolve hardened. The enemy wasn't a distant force anymore. They were faces in the trees, shadows that melted into the foliage. Every firefight, every ambush, left another scar on our bodies or minds. Some scars you could see, others you carried inside. It was near the end of our mission when it happened. We were navigating a series of narrow trails when we came across what looked like an abandoned camp. Cooking pots, sandals, the remnants of a fire, signs of life, left behind in haste. The lieutenant gave the order to sweep the area. We moved cautiously, spreading out to check every corner. My heart pounded with every step. Places like this were rarely abandoned without reason. Riley was the first to call out. He'd found something, hidden in the undergrowth covered with leaves. A weapons cache. Rifles, ammunition, even a few mortar rounds. The lieutenant decided to set an ambush. If the Viet Cong returned, we'd be waiting. We dug in, using the jungle itself as cover, and settled in for the long wait. The hours dragged by, the heat oppressive, the tension unbearable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, set my nerves on edge. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the enemy came. It happened fast, too fast. The first shots lit up the dusk, and the jungle erupted in chaos. I fired blindly into the shadows, the recoil of my rifle jolting through me. Shouts, explosions, the acrid smell of gunpowder. It was all a blur. When it was over, the silence felt deafening. We'd taken the camp, driven the enemy back, but at a cost. 3 more of ours were gone. As we marched back to base the next day, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The jungle, the loss, the endless fight. Vietnam wasn't just a war. It was a test of who you were and what you could endure. Years later, I still hear the jungle in my dreams, still see the faces of those who didn't make it home. I carry them with me, a reminder of what we gave and what we lost.